Well, okay. All right. Well, that's a pretty simple way to put it. It's just as if to underscore your point there, in terms of changing Israelis' policies. We'll start with the taproot on Hamas. Here's Netanyahu a few days back talking about how he plans to actually cut the grass.
של המלחמה בחמאס עומד להסתיים. זה עומד להסתיים. זה לא אומר שהמלחמה עומדת להסתיים, אבל המלחמה בשלב העצים שלה עומדת להסתיים ברפיח, זה נכון. אנחנו נמשיך אחר כך בכיסוח הדשא, לא נוותר להם. אגב, אתם רואים את זה.
So he says the first intensive phase is going to be over, but then he's just going to mow the grass. And for anybody who doesn't know what he means by that, is that they mean that they'll just keep on whacking the Palestinians periodically every time they pop up, almost like a whack-a-mole. And basically that will just continue on without any hesitation or pause.
Yeah, you want to understand, this is very important, that when the fighting first broke out after October 7th between the IDF and Hamas, that Prime Minister Netanyahu said unequivocally that they were going to decisively defeat Hamas. This was the end of Hamas. That has not happened. Hamas is still in the fight. There's no evidence it's going to disappear from the fight. And it's still a potent military force. And there's no way the Israelis are going to defeat Hamas. What this tells you is that the problem in Gaza that led to what happened on October 7th has not gone away. And the Israelis are going to continue to use military force. They're going to continue to mow the grass as a way of dealing with this problem. This means that not only the Israelis, but we, the United States, have no way of getting out of this terrible situation.
Sorry about that. Gave me a little start there. Well, here's the problem. I mean, if it was only that, it would be a big problem because, basically you're saying a forever war and that we're going to have to continue giving all of our ammunition and weapon systems and whatnot to continue this going on. But as Netanyahu continued in that same interview, he's not content with just mowing that grass.
ומכים בהם בעוצמה. אבל אחרי סיום השלב העצים, תהיה לנו אפשרות להעתיק חלק מהכוח צפונה. ואנחנו נעשה את זה. קודם כל למטרות הגנה, ושנית, כדי להחזיר גם, אם נוכל, נעשה את זה בדרך מדינית, אם לא, נעשה את זה בדרך.
And I'm sorry, I actually meant to read that because I know the words are really small in there. But what he's saying there, for those who weren't able to read it, is that he's going to continue to put pressure, and then he's going to move his troops to the north and solve that diplomatically if possible, and then solve it in another way if not possible. Ergo, he's getting ready to go into Lebanon.
I mean, this is really crazy. They have not won the war against Hamas. The Israeli military is exhausted. They're having significant problems with regard to calling up reservists for a second and third time. There are all sorts of articles in places like the Jerusalem Post that talk about problems the commanders are having getting reservists to appear for their second and third tour in Gaza. This is an army that has been stretched thin in Gaza and is in a lot of ways at the end of its rope. And again, they haven't won in Gaza. So now you're telling me that they're going to take this army and they're going to invade southern Lebanon and they're going to defeat Hezbollah and put an end to the problems up in the north of Israel. This is extremely unlikely. The Israelis went into Lebanon in 1982 and they went into Lebanon in 2006, and both were colossal failures. There's no plan that I see that tells me that the IDF has the capability to defeat and erase Hezbollah as a problem. Hezbollah is a much more formidable fighting force than Hamas. And again, they have not defeated Hamas and they have exhausted the IDF in the process. They're now going to go into southern Lebanon and win up there. I don't think that that's a plausible argument.
Well,
So
but
I
here's the
think,
problem, John. Here's the problem with this is if it was again us trying to change Netanyahu's focus or his objectives, whatever, that would be an almost an insurmountable problem. But as we're going to see here, it's actually the U.S. that seems to be encouraging this. Check this CNN piece out.
Last week, Israeli generals approved a plan to attack Lebanon, while Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah recently warned if it comes to war, the group will fight Israel on land, sea, and air, and also inside Israel itself. People have heard here in Lebanon for months now sort of saber rattling coming from Israel, but I think what has people really worried was what we've heard reported on CNN, that the Biden administration has expressed its full support for Israel in the event of full-scale hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel, which is rather reminiscent of the full-bodied support the Americans voiced at the beginning of the disastrous war in Gaza.
So again, I mean, back to the concept of this whole episode here is that U.S. leadership is drawing us closer to escalation, not closer to a culmination of getting these wars done. Why in the world, given what you just said right before I showed that video, would we now want to say we're going to escalate and support and endorse moving into southern Lebanon? Because militarily, I could go spend half the show explaining why that's a disastrous, terrible idea. But you've already articulated that. But what are we doing at the national level, John?
well, I think, Danny, that report was somewhat misleading. I think there is no question that the administration is doing all they can to discourage uh, uh, the IDF from going into Lebanon. We do not want Israel to attack Hezbollah. One of our great fears is that Iran will come in and we'll be in a major war with Iran. But even putting that aside, we do not want another war. The Gaza war is enough. We do not want a war involving Israel and Hezbollah that we might get dragged into. But what we have said, and I think this was foolish, but it was done for domestic politics reasons. We have said to people in the region that if Israel does get involved in a war with Hezbollah, we will back them. And of course, we will back them because we back Israel no matter what it does. That's the way this relationship works. Israel is the tail that wags the dog. There's no question about that. So when we said that, right, we were telling the truth. But the problem is, we're in effect alerting the Israelis that even if they start a war and it doesn't look like a smart thing to do, we'll support them full scale no matter what, which of course we will. And Biden has to do that. And whoever was sitting in the White House would have to do that because the Israel lobby would leave that president, in this case, President Biden, no choice. But the end result is the Israelis are free to do reckless things like invade Lebanon. And given Netanyahu's track record at doing foolish things, this is very worrisome.
And I guess to underscore your point about the tail wagging the dog, was it a week or two ago? Netanyahu very publicly came out and blasted the administration, Blinken in particular, about how dare we withhold 2,000-pound bombs, and claimed that there was other things we were holding back, like it's almost like a Amazon warehouse that they ordered. And what do you mean? Where's my package? How come it hasn't gotten here? As though you don't have any kind of interest or of your own. And instead of really putting them in their place, here was Blinken responding to it. And this sounds more like an apology than it does a retribution.
I'm not going to talk about what we said in diplomatic conversations. I can just say again that we have a commitment to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against a whole variety of threats. Gaza is part of it, but it far surpasses Gaza in terms of the threats they face. The president's committed to that. We continue to move these different cases through our system on regular order. We have one case that the president's talked about publicly about the 2,000-pound bombs and concerns that we have about them being used in densely populated areas. That remains. We continue to work through that, but there's been no change in our posture, which our posture is, again, to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself across these many threats. Many of the systems that are moving through our system are ones that have been on order for, in some cases, years. It takes a long time to move these things. And a number of the things that are going to Israel won't get there for years. That is the nature of the way this works. But it's regular order, with the exception of that one system that we've talked about many times in public.
So there was no, any evidence at all of him saying, "Hey, we're going to do what we're going to do," and don't, just like act like we're going to do whatever you want to. I mean, he was really just trying to wring his hands. Well, it wasn't that, and that just, in my view, didn't tell me what you think. This just tells Netanyahu, yes, you can do whatever you want, and there is nobody in Washington that's ever going to say no to you.
2 points. One is the sense of entitlement on Netanyahu's part is really quite stunning. Just listening to him talk, it's really quite amazing that he just feels that Israel is entitled to this weaponry, period. And the United States has no choice but to give him that weaponry. No sense that, he's dealing with a superpower here, that he's beholden to the United States in any way. Just a really profound sense of entitlement. And as an American, it bothers me enormously. But with regard to your comment, I think the fact is that Netanyahu understands full well that he can do pretty much anything he wants, and he will get all the aid he wants from the United States. He understands full well that the lobby is incredibly powerful in the United States, and no American politician is going to cross Israel in a meaningful way. No American politician is going to stand up for the American national interest if that president thinks the American national interest is at odds with Israel's national interest. The American president will do what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu fully understands that. And that's why he treats us with contempt, because he understands that when it comes to Israel, American politicians or American leaders have zero backbone. And everything we've seen since October 7th, including Tony Blinken's performance a minute ago on your show, makes it clear that Netanyahu is right. He should treat the Americans with contempt because they are deserving of that contempt.
Wow, really, I'm almost speechless. I have nothing to say at all to that. But here's the gist of this. All right, so we first talked about the Russia-Ukraine war and American leadership causing lots of those problems, or at least exacerbating it. Now then, we just talked about the stuff going on in the Middle East. Here's where these things mesh together, which causes even more alarm to escalation. Escalation in one area is bad, one area, the other area is also bad. But when they start kind of coalescing, then our flexibility gets worse. So first of all, you have in the Russia-Ukraine situation, United States saying we're going to change policies and openly allow Ukraine to use our weapons onto Russian territory. The Russian president says, okay, we're going to do a tit for tat, and now I'm not going to withhold it from my ability the issue of giving weapons to your enemies, wherever they may be, state, non-state, who knows? We don't know what he's going to do. That's what he meant. He then went to North Korea, made a big deal, a military pact with them, mutual defense deal that has lots of issues for ammunition and weapons and whatnot. And then you have the possibility, if Israel does launch a war and gets into one with Hezbollah, then there's the very real possibility that Iran gets involved, because I think it would be very unlikely that they're going to allow Hezbollah in the event that Israel started winning, that they're going to allow them to go down without getting involved themselves. And of course, then there's going to be real threat possibilities for the United States to also get involved. Lots of people are already saying we should do that in the United States. Then here's where the next rub comes into. Would Vladimir Putin make good on his threat before to arm Iran? so that they can now do more to the U.S. Israeli side. And then you see that this stuff just all gets mixed in together. And to me, now then the risk all across the board rises.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting set of comments, Danny. Just to sort of build on what you said, uh, if the Israelis go into Lebanon, that war is likely to spill over into Syria as it has in the past, because Syria and Lebanon are neighbors. Uh, and you want to remember the Russians are in Syria in a big way. And it could be the case that the Russians get involved with the Israelis in Syria. I'm not saying that's likely, but it is a possible outcome of a war between Israel and Hezbollah. Furthermore, if Iran gets involved in a war involving Hezbollah and Israel, that would be a huge problem for the United States, because we undoubtedly get sucked in at that point. And then the question is, what would the Russians do? The Russians would surely help the Iranians as well as the Syrians. So you see, the US Russia competition is beginning to manifest itself not simply in Eastern Europe, in a place like Ukraine, but here in the Middle East. Reminds you a lot of the Cold War, when the Americans and the Soviets, competed in the Cold War. And in fact, in 1973, I remember when American nuclear forces were put on alert during the Yom Kippur War, and people were fearing a U.S. Soviet conflict. So, what you're seeing here is that the two scenarios that we worry about, the Ukraine scenario and the Gaza scenario, look like they're more and more interconnected. One final point on this, Danny, and that is the Iran nuclear issue. You want to remember that the Russians can give the Russians can give the Iranians all sorts of uh, uh, air defense missiles that could be used to protect their nuclear assets.
Mm.
And furthermore, the Russians can look the other way if the Iranians decide to go down the nuclear road. In the past, we have depended heavily on both the Russians and the Chinese, and of course, the major European powers, to help us corral the Iranians when it comes to developing nuclear weapons. But if things get dicey enough between the Russians and the Americans, and even the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians may be willing to, in effect, protect the Iranians as they go down the nuclear road, not simply by giving them weapons to defend themselves, air defense weapons, but also by just protecting them diplomatically. So there are just lots of ways things can spin out of control moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, obviously this is no prediction that any one of these things is going to happen, but it's to show that almost all the things that we've been talking about here are plausible, and the a theme that undergirds all of them in very rickety supports is American leadership. Because, and I think you've said this before, with decisive American leadership, we could shut down the war in Israel. We could shut down the war in Hezbollah, in Russia and Ukraine. There's lots of things that we could do to bring those things to rapid conclusions, and we're doing nothing, even seeking diplomatic anything. We're just feeding them both and wondering what's going to happen next. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just to take each one, I think in the case of the Middle East, the case of the Gaza war, we're desperate to shut down the Gaza war, and we're desperate not to let it escalate, to include a war against Hezbollah or a war involving Iran. But we have zero maneuver room, in large part because of the Israel lobby here in the United States.
Well, we have
Which,
no maneuver room because we're unwilling to use the leverage. I mean, it's a political choice, right?
well, you can make that argument for sure, but whatever president crosses the lobby will pay an enormous price, as many politicians are finding out these days in the United States. No president's going to cross the lobby. And if you look at President Trump, he kowtows to the lobby every bit as much as President Biden does, and as their predecessors did, and that will be true, moving forward. So we just
Until the kowtowing ends up getting us sucked into a war that we actually can't get out of if we pay a price, then I bet there'll be a lot of willingness to stand up to that lobby if it hurts us. But I agree with you. I'm not arguing with you at all. I agree with what you described is absolutely almost ironclad. And I fear that because we won't have anybody willing to stand up and do what's right, no matter the political cost to them, we could end up in a war just because we're just letting the events take their course.
You're not going to get any disagreement from me on that. But then just to go over to the Ukraine war, it's actually a different situation there. There, we're actually upping the ante on our own, as I described
Oh
in my
man.
earlier comments. I mean, you and I both agree, if anything, what we should be doing is working overtime now to shut that war down, because we both believe that from a strategic point of view and a moral point of view, that's the best outcome for Ukraine, not to mention the United States and the West more generally. But we're doing the exact opposite. So we're behaving in remarkably foolish ways uh, in Ukraine. I think, again, to go back to the Middle East, there we have our hands tied behind our back. I think we have a good sense of what needs to be done in the Middle East. We just can't do it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. And uh, man, it's just you see the current administration. There's if they win the election this November, it's very likely that they'll just continue with the status quo going forward. And if Trump ends up winning, at least what he's been saying lately, he'll have a pretty dramatic change, at least in that one war. And then at
Yeah.
least we can get one thing off our plate if we get in there, or at least there's a possibility of it. But uh, man, right now I just worry because I don't know who the President Trump would bring on his team that's going to be fundamentally better, especially in foreign policy and leadership level, to do the hard things that are necessary to keep us safe. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see how things play out.
Yeah, I think all the evidence is that Trump has the right instincts on Ukraine, that he understands it's time to cut a deal, and that would be best for Ukraine and best for the United States. But his forte is not the execution of foreign policy, as we know well. And it's not clear that he will bring in people who can execute that basic strategy that he has in mind. Furthermore, even if he brings in really smart people and they go to work in smart ways, the fact is there will be tremendous resistance. There are just
Yeah.
a huge number of people, as we both know, who are committed to upping the ante against the Russians and in support of Ukraine and not ending this war. So I don't want to say that Trump will run into a brick wall, but he's going to run into a wall that's not going to be easy to plow through.
Yeah, that's for sure. We've seen that play out already once in several other areas, and I have no doubts that that would be the case again. But I guess we'll just have to leave it there for now and wait and see what happens. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much for coming on today. It's always a delight and a pleasure to get to run through these issues with you, and thanks for sharing with us today.
It was my pleasure, Danny. I always enjoy talking about these issues, as depressing as the issues are, and they are mighty depressing.
They really are. Thank you very much. And we thank you guys for joining us today. Be sure, really, like and subscribe. Share this with everybody that you know, because, folks, as ugly and hard as this stuff is, it is the truth. You deserve to know the truth, and you're just not going to get it on any of the mainstream networks. That's why we have